The wind was a thief, stealing the last of the warmth from the rough-hewn planks of the cabin. It moaned through the chinks in the walls, a lonely sound that echoed the hollow space in Eliza's chest. Outside, the Montana sky was the color of a fresh bruise, spitting pellets of ice that clicked against the single glass pane of the window. Each sound was a reminder of her isolation, a punctuation mark on the sentence of her solitude. Thomas had been gone 6 months, taken by a fever that burned through him as quickly as a prairie fire. He had left her with this small patch of unforgiving land, a half-finished barn, and a silence that was heavier than any stone. The cold was more than just the absence of heat. It was a physical presence that seeped into her bones, a constant companion since his last breath had fogged the air in this very room. She pulled the thin wool blanket tighter around her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the letter resting on the small pine table. The banker's script was elegant, a cruel irony against the bluntness of his words. Foreclosure. 30 days. 30 days until the world she knew, the life she and Thomas had bled for, would be officially erased. Fear was a familiar taste in her mouth, metallic and sharp like blood. She was a widow. In the eyes of the townsfolk in Prairie Ridge, that word meant she was fragile, pitiable, and, worst of all, available. A problem to be solved or a prize to be claimed. Their pity felt like sandpaper against her raw grief, their speculative glances like trespassing hands. She had tried. Lord, how she had tried. She had mended the fences, tended the meager garden until the first frost blackened the last of the tomato vines, and tried to sell her preserves in town, only to be met with tight-lipped smiles and condescending advice. A woman can't run a homestead alone, dear. Mrs. Gable's words, delivered with a syrupy sympathy that didn't quite mask her morbid curiosity, still rang in her ears. The truth was, she was failing. The woodpile was a pathetic mound of scraps, not nearly enough to fight off the coming deep winter. The flour sack was limp and nearly empty. Despair was a quiet, creeping thing, and it had its cold fingers wrapped firmly around her heart. Looking out the window, past the skeletal arms of the cottonwood tree, she could just see the edge of the next property, a dark line of trees that marked the beginning of Silas Blackwood's land. The town spoke of him in whispers, a man scarred by the war or by something worse. He kept to himself, a silent, hulking shape seen only at a distance, trading furs for necessities and speaking to no one. They said he was broken, that his mind had been touched by darkness. They made bets in the saloon that his bed would stay empty until the day he died. He was a ghost on the edge of their world, a cautionary tale whispered to children. To Eliza, he was just another shadow in a landscape full of them, another reminder of how vast and empty this place could be. The fire in the hearth sputtered, a weak and dying thing. It cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the small cabin feel vast and threatening. She closed her eyes, imagining the warmth of Thomas's hand in hers. But the memory was fading, growing as thin and cold as the winter air. There was no one coming, no one to help. The realization settled not with a crash, but with a quiet, devastating weight. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The next morning, the world was sheathed in a brittle layer of ice. The cold was sharp in her lungs as she stepped onto the porch, her breath a white plume in the air. She stopped, her body freezing for a different reason. Stacked neatly beside her door was a small mountain of split oak and pine. It was a perfect woodpile, the pieces cut to the exact length for her small hearth, the kindling arranged in a careful bundle on top. It hadn't been there when she had barred the door last night. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She scanned the horizon, the empty expanse of snow-dusted prairie and the dark sentinel trees of the woods. There was no one, no tracks but her own small ones from the day before, now glazed with ice. The wood was a mystery, an impossibility, felt like a threat, a sign that someone had been here, watching her, close enough to see the pathetic wisps of smoke from her dying fire. She spent the day in a state of high alert, the heavy axe leaning by the door, her senses stretched taut. Every creak of the cabin, every whistle of the wind, sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. But the day passed in unnerving silence. That night, for the first time in weeks, the cabin was filled with a steady, roaring warmth. The heat pushed back the shadows and eased the ache in her bones, but it did nothing to calm the unease in her soul. 2 days later, it happened again. This time, it was a rabbit, cleaned and dressed, hanging from a nail on the porch post. Its placement was deliberate, respectful. Not a careless offering, but a provision. Panic warred with a desperate, burgeoning gratitude. Who was doing this? Why? Her mind immediately went to the men in town. Mr. Henderson, the banker, whose sympathetic smiles never reached his cold, assessing eyes? Or perhaps one of the ranchers who looked at her land with a greedy glint. No, this was different. There was no posturing in it, no expectation. It was silent. It was practical. It was capable. It had to be him. Silas Blackwood, the ghost from the woods. The idea was both terrifying and, strangely, less so than the alternatives. He was an outcast, a man they all feared, but this quiet assistance felt nothing like the clumsy, predatory advances she deflected in town. She began to watch the tree line. From the corner of her window, she would stare at the dark woods bordering her property, searching for a sign of movement. For days she saw nothing. The silent gifts continued, another rabbit, a small sack of potatoes left by the well. Each one chipped away at her fear, replacing it with a profound and unsettling curiosity. She was being cared for in a way, watched over by a man the entire county had dismissed as a monster. She had to know. One afternoon, armed with a new and unfamiliar resolve, she pulled on her thickest shawl and walked towards the woods, towards Silas Blackwood's land. The snow crunched under her boots, the only sound in the vast stillness. She stopped at the dilapidated fence that marked their shared boundary, her heart a wild thing in her throat. And then she saw him. He was standing near the edge of the trees, an axe resting in his hand. He wasn't the hulking brute of town gossip, but a tall man, broad-shouldered from work, not bulk. He stood perfectly still, watching her, and she knew he had been aware of her approach the entire time. He made no move, his face partially obscured by shadow and a rough beard. One side of his face bore a long, jagged scar that pulled at the corner of his eye, giving him a permanent look of grim appraisal. It was the mark that fueled the town's fearful stories. Eliza's prepared words, her practiced demands and questions, evaporated on the cold air. She could only stand there, the silence stretching between them. Finally, she found her voice, a small, wavering thing. "The wood," she said, her breath clouding in front of her. "The food. It was you." He didn't speak. He simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. His eyes, she could see now, were not cold or cruel. They were a startlingly clear gray, and they held a deep, profound stillness, like a forest pool. "Why?" she asked, the word barely a whisper. He shifted his weight, his gaze dropping to the axe in his hand for a moment before returning to her face. "Chimney smoke was thin," he said. His voice was rough, a low baritone and used to conversation. "Winter's not a time to be cold." It was the simplest of explanations, yet it held more kindness than all the syrupy condolences she had received in town. There was no pity in his voice, only a statement of fact. He saw a problem and he fixed it. She stood there, searching for what to say next, how to navigate this strange, unspoken territory. I can't pay you," she managed, the admission of familiar shame. He looked at her then, a long, searching look that seemed to see right through the layers of her grief and fear, to the resilient core she had forgotten was there. "Not a skin for payment," he said, and with another slight nod, he turned and walked back into the deep shadows of the pines, leaving her alone with the echo of his words and a feeling she hadn't experienced in a very long time. A fragile, tentative flicker of hope. That brief exchange cracked something open between them. The silence that had once separated their properties now felt different, less a void and more a space of quiet observation. He never crossed the fence line onto her property again while she was watching, but the provisions continued to appear. And she, in turn, began to leave things for him on her side of the fence post. A jar of the blackberry preserves she was so proud of. A small loaf of bread, baked in an oven now properly heated. They were small gestures, a conversation held without words, a currency of mutual respect. One blustery afternoon, as she was struggling to secure a loose shutter that was banging against the cabin wall in the rising wind, a gust nearly tore it from her hands. She cried out in frustration, her fingers numb with cold. Suddenly, a shadow fell over her. Silas was there on her side of the fence. He had moved with such silence she hadn't heard him approach. Without a word, he took the shutter from her, his large, calloused hands easily managing what she could not. He pulled a few nails and a hammer from a leather pouch on his belt and, with a few efficient, powerful strikes, secured the shutter firmly in place. He worked with a focused economy of motion, a man who understood the language of tools and wood and wind. When he was finished, he tested it, giving it a firm push. It didn't budge. He turned to look at her, his gray eyes searching her face. "The roof shingles on the north side are comin' loose," he stated, not as a criticism, but as an observation. "Storm's gettin' worse," she could only nod, a lump forming in her throat. She had known about the shingles, had lain awake at night listening to them rattle, praying they would hold. "I don't know how to fix it," she confessed, the words tasting of failure. "I'll show you," he said simply. And he did. He led her to the barn, found the spare shingles Thomas had bought but never used, and showed her how to heat the tar, how to place the nail. He didn't do the work for her. He did it with her, guiding her hands, his instructions sparse and clear. They worked together as the sky darkened and the wind howled around them. A strange, silent team against the coming storm. The storm broke with a furious vengeance, trapping them in the dim light of the cabin. The wind shrieked, and the snow came down in a blinding sheet, erasing the world outside. They sat at the small table, the roaring fire Silas had built casting a warm, flickering glow. For hours they barely spoke. The shared work, the howling gale outside, seemed to be enough of a conversation. Eliza made a thin stew from the last of her vegetables and the rabbit he had brought. She watched him as he ate, his movements deliberate and contained. He held himself with a stillness that was not empty, but full, as if he were constantly listening, observing. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes tracked the shadows in the corners of the room. This was a man accustomed to being on his guard. "The town?" she began, her voice soft. "They say things about you." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he did not look up from his bowl. "They say you're dangerous." He finally raised his eyes to meet hers. The firelight danced across the scar on his face, making it seem deeper, more severe. "And what do you say, Mrs. Miller?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. The question hung in the air between them. It was a test. He wasn't asking what she thought of him, but what she chose to believe. The fearful whispers of others, or the evidence of her own eyes. She thought of the neatly stacked firewood, the repaired shutter, the patient way he had shown her how to fix her own roof. She thought of the quiet respect in his gaze. "I say," she said, her voice clear and steady, "that you are a good man, Mr. Blackwood." A flicker of something, surprise, relief, something more vulnerable, passed through his guarded expression before it was gone. He gave a single, slow nod and went back to his stew. But the air in the room had changed. The space between them had shrunk. He was no longer just a neighbor, a mysterious benefactor. He was Silas. And for the first time, Eliza felt that she was not just the widow Miller. She was herself. The storm raged on, but inside the small, warm cabin, a different kind of quiet had settled, one born not of loneliness, but of understanding. The blizzard lasted for 3 days. By the time the snow stopped and a weak sun emerged, the world was buried and silent. The drifts were piled high against the cabin, and the path to the barn was a deep trench they had to dig together. The shared labor forged a new kind of intimacy between them, a rhythm of work and rest, of unspoken requests and anticipated needs. When the roads were finally clear enough for her to travel to town for supplies, The atmosphere was thick with suspicion. Her wagon, loaded with furs Silas had given her to trade, was evidence enough for the gossips. Mrs. Gable cornered her in the mercantile, her face a mask of false concern. "Eliza, dear," she began, her voice dripping with insinuation. "A woman alone must be so careful. To be entertaining a man like that. People will talk." The woman's eyes darted around the store, ensuring she had an audience. A year ago, even a month ago, Eliza would have flushed with shame and hurried away. But something had shifted within her. She thought of Silas's quiet dignity, of his calloused hands repairing her home, of the respect in his eyes. She squared her shoulders and looked Mrs. Gable directly in the eye. "Mr. Blackwood has been a better neighbor to me than anyone in this town," she said, her voice low but carrying in the suddenly silent store. "His character is not something I will allow you to question." Mrs. Gable's jaw dropped, her face paling. Without another word, Eliza paid for her flour and salt, holding her head high as she walked out into the cold sunlight. She had not only defended Silas, she had defended herself. She had drawn a line in the snow, and for the first time, she felt like she was standing on solid ground. Her small act of defiance did not go unnoticed. Later that week, Mr. Henderson, the banker, paid her a visit. He arrived in a polished buggy that looked absurdly out of place against the rustic landscape. His smile was as slick as the ice on a frozen puddle. "Mrs. Miller," he said, tipping his hat. "I was concerned. I heard you've taken in company." His gaze swept over the well-tended woodpile, the secure roof, the subtle signs of a capable hand at work. His eyes narrowed. "The bank has a vested interest in the upkeep of this property. You understand. The property is being maintained," Eliza said, her voice colder than she thought possible. She did not invite him in. "Of course," he oozed, stepping closer. "But perhaps there are other ways to secure your position. A woman of your attributes need not struggle so. The debt could be renegotiated." The implication was unmistakable, a vile slickness that made her skin crawl. Before she could react, the door of the barn creaked open. Silas emerged, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He had been mending a broken hinge on her wagon. He didn't hurry. He simply walked to stand beside her on the porch, his presence a solid, unmovable wall. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He just looked at Henderson, his gray eyes flat and hard as granite. The banker's practiced smile faltered. He took a nervous step back, his bravado evaporating under that silent, unwavering gaze. He stammered something about returning another time, scrambled back into his buggy, and fled, his horse kicking up sprays of slushy snow. Eliza stood beside Silas, watching him go. She was trembling, not with fear, but with a cold, clarifying anger. "He will be back," she said, her voice tight. Silas nodded, his eyes still on the road where the buggy had disappeared. "We'll be ready," he said. It was the first time he had used the word we. It settled in the space between them, a promise as solid and real as the ground beneath their feet. Henderson returned a week later, and he did not come alone. He brought 2 hired men with him, rough-looking drifters whose eyes held the dull gleam of cruelty. They rode up to the fence line, Henderson brandishing a sheaf of papers. "This is it, Mrs. Miller. The grace period is over. The bank is taking possession." Now Eliza's heart pounded, but she stood her ground on the porch. Silas was there, just inside the cabin door, out of sight but close. She remembered the nights spent with Thomas, poring over the deed and the maps of their land, their fingers tracing the lines of the life they planned to build. "Your notice gives me until the end of the month, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "That is not today. A technicality," he sneered. "I'm taking what's mine. Get off my property." His men began to dismount, their intentions clear. This was not a legal eviction. It was an act of brute force. "You're mistaken," Eliza said, her voice rising with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "This isn't your property." Not all of it, she pointed towards the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the homestead. The original survey marker, the one from the county charter of '72, is that large standing stone by the water. Your bank deed is based on the revised survey from last year, a survey you commissioned, which conveniently moves the boundary 100 yards west. According to the original charter, this house, this barn, they stand on land that was never part of the mortgage. Henderson's face went from smug to purple with rage. That's a lie. There is no stone. There is... A low voice rumbled from the doorway. Silas stepped out onto the porch, a hunting rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. He wasn't pointing it. He didn't need to. His presence was a physical declaration. I've seen it myself, buried in the overgrowth. Took me a day to clear it. The two hired men looked from the rifle to Silas's scarred face, then back to their furious employer. They were paid to intimidate a lone woman, not to face down a man who looked like he had walked through hell and back. One of them shook his head slightly, taking a step back towards his horse. Henderson was sputtering, his face contorted in a mask of impotent fury. He had been outmaneuvered not by force, but by knowledge, by truth. He had counted on her ignorance and her fear. He had not counted on her intelligence, and he certainly had not counted on Silas. Defeated and humiliated, he barked at his men, turned his horse, and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and curses in his wake. Eliza let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her knees suddenly weak. Silas's hand came to rest on her arm, steadying her. His touch was firm, protective. They stood together, watching the last of the threat disappear over the horizon. The land was safe. It was hers. In the weeks that followed, a gentle peace settled over the homestead. The thaw of spring arrived, softening the hard edges of the land. The creek swelled with melting snow, and the first green shoots pushed their way through the damp earth. The work was constant, but it was no longer a desperate struggle for survival. It was a hopeful act of creation. Eliza and Silas worked side by side, their movements falling into an easy, familiar rhythm. They repaired the barn, plowed the small field, and planted seeds for the coming season. The silence between them was different now. It was a comfortable, shared space, punctuated by the sounds of their labor and the occasional, brief exchange. They learned each other's habits. The way she hummed softly when she worked the soil, the way he would pause and tilt his head, listening to the birdsong. He was no longer a ghost from the woods, and she was no longer just a widow. They were two people remaking a world together. They had faced down the harshness of the winter, the cruelty of gossip, and the greed of men, and they had endured. More than that, they had built something new in the wreckage of their old lives. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, they sat on the porch steps, watching the light fade. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of damp earth and new life. He had been quiet for a long time, his gaze on the distant mountains. "The scar," he said, his voice quiet. "I got it at Cold Harbor. Piece of shrapnel. The men beside me weren't so lucky." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. In that simple, unadorned confession, she heard years of pain, of survival, of a deep and abiding sorrow that had driven him into solitude. He was sharing the source of his hauntedness, offering it to her not as a burden, but as a truth. She didn't offer platitudes or sympathy. She simply listened, accepting the piece of his past he had given her. She thought of how the town saw them, the broken man and the grieving woman. Perhaps they were broken, in a way, but like a bone that heals stronger, their fractures had become their strength. He turned to look at her, his gray eyes clear in the twilight. The question he had been holding for months, the one that had lived in his silent acts of kindness and his steady presence, was there in his gaze. Slowly, he reached out and took her hand. His palm was rough and calloused, but his touch was gentle. She laced her fingers through his, her own hand small but no longer trembling. It was not a grand, passionate declaration. It was something quieter, deeper, and more real. It was a promise, a beginning. Here, on this small patch of land they had fought for, Under the vast and watchful sky, two solitary souls had found a home in each other. His bed would not be empty anymore, and her heart, she realized, was finally, astonishingly, full.